Imagine being dragged in chains through the streets of Kingston, Jamaica. Crowds line the dusty road, screaming insults and throwing rotting fruit. You're barely 19 years old, and in 3 hours, you'll face not just execution, but the kind of punishment sailors whispered about in dark taverns. What British executioners did with women before the official hanging, the depraved humiliations that never made it into court records. This isn't fiction. This was reality for dozens of women who dared to become pirates during the golden age of piracy. Today, we remember names like Anne Bonny and Mary Read as romantic legends. But the truth about what happened to captured female pirates is far darker than any Hollywood movie would dare to show. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about piracy, justice, and how women were treated in the 18th century. Because when female pirates were captured, they didn't just face punishment. They faced a deliberate campaign to break them as warnings to other women who might dare to dream of freedom. And yet, as harsh as these documented punishments sound, they weren't the worst. The darkest fate was kept off the official record, passed down in hushed stories of what some women endured before they ever reached the scaffold. Picture the courthouse in Spanish Town, Jamaica, in November 1720. The building is packed beyond capacity. People have traveled for days to witness something unprecedented and scandalous. 2 women standing trial for piracy on the high seas. But this wasn't really a trial. It was theater designed to expose and humiliate. Anne Bonny and Mary Read stood in chains before a panel of 7 judges, all men hungry for salacious details. The prosecution didn't just present evidence of piracy. They painted lurid pictures of life aboard a pirate ship with particular attention to the women's shocking behavior. Witnesses described in breathless detail how these women had cursed like sailors, dressed like men, and fought with savage intensity. But the most scandalous testimony focused on their personal lives. One witness claimed Mary Read had challenged a man to a duel to defend her lover's honor. Another described seeing Anne Bonny in compromising positions with various crew members. The judges were particularly obsessed with the women's clothing. Court records spend pages describing how they wore men's jackets, trousers, and boots. They bound their breasts to hide their sex and walked with masculine swagger. This wasn't just disguise for practical purposes. In the court's view, it was evidence of their fundamental corruption and perversion of natural order. The trial became a public sensation, with crowds gathering daily to hear the latest scandalous revelations. Street vendors sold pamphlets with lurid illustrations of the women in various states of undress and compromising situations. When the women were finally allowed to speak in their own defense, they said almost nothing. What could they say? The facts were undisputed, and the court seemed more interested in exposing their intimate secrets than determining guilt or innocence. Both women announced they were pregnant. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Here were women who had not only committed piracy, but had done so while carrying illegitimate children. The scandal was almost too much for polite society to bear. This was called pleading the belly, and it saved their lives temporarily. But it also added another layer of scandal to their already shocking story. Mary Read died in prison before her child was born. Some claimed from shame as much as illness. Anne Bonny disappeared from historical records entirely, though rumors persisted for decades about her ultimate fate. But for most female pirates, there was no pregnancy to save them from what came next. London's execution dock sat on the muddy banks of the Thames River, where the stench of low tide mixed with the smell of fear and death. This was where the British Empire staged its most dramatic punishments for maritime crimes. Officially, the records say women were hanged just like men. But tales passed down through generations of dock workers told a different story. Stories too indecent for the official record suggested that British executioners treated female pirates very differently indeed. Some claimed the spectacle didn't begin on the scaffold. It began hours earlier, in the hands of men who saw these women as playthings before prisoners. The ritual of execution at Wapping drew massive crowds that came not just for justice, but for entertainment that bordered on the obscene. Pirates sentenced to death were paraded through the streets while crowds jeered and threw garbage. But for women, the route deliberately passed brothels and taverns where they would face the most degrading taunts. At execution dock itself, female pirates faced the short drop method of hanging. This meant slow strangulation that could take 15 minutes or more, with the body convulsing grotesquely before death finally came. The crowds loved it. Mary Harley, captured off the coast of North Carolina in 1726, had served as quartermaster aboard a pirate vessel commanding respect through her fierce reputation. On the day of her execution, crowds gathered from across the colony to witness something unprecedented. Street vendors sold food, drink, and crude pamphlets, depicting her in compromising situations. But colonial letters discovered centuries later hint at degrading preparations that took place before Mary ever reached the scaffold. The exact nature of these preliminaries was never documented officially, but several accounts murmur of rituals designed to strip away dignity long before the noose did its work. The crowds wanted more than just death. They wanted humiliation, degradation, and the satisfaction of seeing a woman who had defied all social order reduced to a broken spectacle. Mary Harley faced the noose with remarkable composure despite whatever she had endured. When asked if she repented, she said only that she regretted nothing except being captured. But while some women met shame in public view, others faced punishments hidden behind closed doors. Public flogging was reserved for female pirates, who authorities wanted to keep alive as living examples. But these weren't ordinary beatings. Colonial records hint at calculated spectacles that combined legal punishment with sexual degradation. The cat-o'-nine-tails was designed to strip flesh from bone. But for women, the real torture was the shameful exposure that accompanied each stroke. Female pirates were stripped to the waist in front of jeering crowds, their bodies violated not just by the whip but by hundreds of leering eyes. Rebecca Martinez, a Spanish woman captured near Havana in 1732, had abandoned her arranged marriage to live freely with her pirate lover. When Spanish authorities sentenced her to 50 lashes in the public square of Cartagena, they scheduled the punishment for market day to ensure maximum attendance and maximum shame. But colonial correspondence suggests Rebecca's flogging was designed as much for voyeuristic pleasure as legal justice. Before the beating began, she was paraded through the streets wearing signs that proclaimed her not just a criminal, but a fallen woman who had lived in sin with rough sailors. The crowd was encouraged to jeer at her exposed body, turning punishment into perverted entertainment. Guards allegedly accepted coins from spectators who wanted closer looks at the condemned woman's flesh. The first lash tore open her skin. By the 10th, blood streamed down her back. By the 20th, she had lost consciousness, but Spanish law required the sentence to continue. After the flogging, Rebecca was left tied to the post for hours while crowds gawked at her broken body. She survived, scarred inside and out, her humiliation serving as a warning about abandoning feminine virtue. Yet being stripped and flogged before a jeering crowd was not the worst fate. Some women were taken where no crowd could witness what happened next. Here's where official records end and the darkest rumors begin. Not every captured female pirate was executed or flogged. Some simply vanished into the shadows of colonial society, their ultimate destinations too scandalous to document. This was particularly true for women of mixed race found aboard pirate vessels. Maria Santos, of mixed African and Spanish heritage, was captured aboard a pirate ship in 1728. Instead of trying her for piracy, Spanish authorities classified her as stolen property and sold her at auction in Caracas. But buyers at such sales weren't seeking field hands. Colonial correspondence hints at private collectors who specialized in acquiring exotic women with criminal pasts for purposes too shameful to discuss openly. Former pirate captains were reduced to concubines in arrangements that combined sexual slavery with the twisted pleasure their owners derived from possessing such notorious women. One British colonial governor wrote privately about acquiring a former pirate wench for his household, describing methods used to break her rebellious spirit that were too explicit for his official correspondence. Port gossip claims some officials maintained entire collections of such women, their criminal backgrounds adding perverse appeal to their subjugation. For women who had once commanded ships and crews, this reduction to sexual property represented the ultimate victory of colonial authority. They went from feared captains to anonymous playthings, their stories buried along with their identities in arrangements deemed too perverted for official acknowledgement. And yet, for all the degradation of sexual slavery, sailors still murmured about a punishment more horrifying than any of these. Prison ships anchored in harbors across the British Empire weren't just floating dungeons. According to those who served aboard them, they were floating brothels where unspeakable acts took place in the darkness below deck. These decommissioned warships held hundreds of prisoners in conditions so foul that even hardened sailors refused unnecessary trips below. The stench of human waste mixed with bilge water created a toxic atmosphere where disease spread like wildfire. But for the handful of women aboard these vessels, disease was often a mercy compared to what the living inflicted. Elizabeth Harper, captured near Barbados in 1734, was sentenced to imprisonment aboard HMS Jersey. The ship held over 800 prisoners, but Elizabeth was one of perhaps 3 women in that floating hell. Prison letters discovered decades later paint disturbing pictures of systematic exploitation that guards either orchestrated or ignored completely. The Jersey's hold was divided into sections, but female prisoners were often moved at night to areas where their screams couldn't reach the upper decks. Elizabeth survived 6 months before succumbing to what prison records listed as fever, but fellow prisoners described finding her chained in the ship's deepest compartment, her body covered in infected wounds that suggested trauma far beyond disease. One surviving letter describes Elizabeth's final days in heartbreaking detail. She kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "I should have died fighting." Her death was recorded as natural causes, but the circumstances suggested she died from shame and brutality rather than illness. Prison ships were where the British Empire sent people it wanted to disappear completely. Female pirates faced not just death in these floating tombs, but degradation so severe that even hardened criminals spoke of them only in horrified whispers. The silence from these vessels wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of atrocities too shameful for any official record. But here's what makes these stories even more scandalous. Many female pirates refused to be broken, even when facing the most degrading punishments imaginable. Their continued defiance in the face of sexual humiliation both aroused and infuriated their captors. Anne Bonny's last recorded words perfectly capture this spirit of unbroken rebellion. When Calico Jack was led to execution, she told him, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Even facing her own uncertain fate, she showed contempt for masculine weakness. Port stories claimed that some female pirates actually seemed to enjoy shocking their captors with shameless behavior that violated every expectation of proper feminine submission. Mary Read reportedly told fellow prisoners she would continue fighting and would kill anyone who tried to treat her as a helpless woman, even in chains. Sarah Bishop, captured off New England in 1729, refused to show proper feminine remorse during her trial. When sentenced to flogging, she allegedly bit through her own tongue rather than give her torturers the satisfaction of hearing her scream. Some guards found such displays of defiance perversely arousing, leading to even more twisted forms of punishment. Isabella Rodrigues, a Portuguese woman who commanded her own crew, became legendary for her response to Spanish capture. When offered commutation in exchange for information, she spat in the colonial governor's face and declared she would rather die as a captain than live as anyone's whore. Even aboard the hellish prison ships, women maintained networks of mutual protection and sometimes organized acts of sabotage that resulted in brutal retaliation. Their refusal to accept victimhood created legends that spread through every port, growing more outrageous with each telling. Every act of defiance became a source of scandalous admiration that challenged the entire system designed to break female independence through sexual degradation. Here's the most intriguing truth about captured female pirates. The most scandalous stories were deliberately buried. Colonial archives contain suspicious gaps where explicit testimony should exist. Trial transcripts break off precisely when evidence becomes most graphic. Ships' logs describing female crew members are edited or destroyed, often right at the passages detailing intimate arrangements. This wasn't accident. It was systematic suppression of scandals, too explosive for official preservation, but too widespread to ignore completely. The silence isn't empty space. It's evidence of atrocities so outrageous that even an age comfortable with public executions found them too indecent to document. Private letters hint at systematic sexual exploitation disguised as legal punishment. Colonial correspondence refers obliquely to shameful pleasures and unspeakable arrangements involving female prisoners. Court documents stop abruptly just when testimony would have revealed the most compromising details. Even the few female pirates remembered in popular culture were sanitized beyond recognition. Anne Bonny and Mary Read became tragic figures driven to crime by love, rather than the sexually liberated women who had scandalized colonial society with their shameless independence and multiple lovers. The real stories of women who had used their sexuality as both weapon and shield, who had commanded crews through combinations of violence and seduction, who had lived by their own rules in defiance of every social convention. These tales were deemed too dangerous for preservation. What survives are fragments that hint at systematic perversion hidden behind legal facades. The official records are silent, perhaps not because these things never happened, but because they were too shameful to preserve in ink. As we reach the end of this journey into the shadows of maritime justice, one truth emerges from the darkness. The most scandalous punishments were never recorded in official documents. They survived only in fragments, hints, and stories passed down through generations of sailors who swore them to be true. The women who vanished into sexual slavery, who were degraded before execution, who suffered unspeakable torments aboard prison ships, weren't just victims of legal punishment. They were casualties of a system that found their independence both threatening and arousing. Colonial authorities destroyed evidence not because these women were innocent, but because their fates were too perverted for public acknowledgement. What happened to them in the hours between capture and official punishment created scandals that officials buried deeper than any pirate treasure. Every female pirate who faced degradation with unbroken defiance became a source of scandalous legend that outlasted any legal judgment. Their courage in the face of sexual humiliation created stories that spread through every port, growing more explicit and outrageous with each telling. We may never know the full truth about what happened behind prison walls, in colonial mansions, aboard rotting ships anchored in forgotten harbors. What we do know is that the rumors were dark enough and detailed enough to keep sailors talking in hushed tones for generations. For some women, the noose was mercy. For others, the true punishment was what came before. What do you think really happened in those hours, hidden from the records? Share your thoughts below, and click the video YouTube has chosen for you next.